You can go ahead with this.
Yes, sir?
Yes.
Okay. Once again, good evening, everyone. So as sir mentioned, my presentation is going to be on the Sri Lankan Civil War. Specifically, I will be talking about women and children in conflict zones and their impacts. So essentially, as we all know, a conflict is a clash of interests or opinions that cannot be reconciled and needs some form of resolution or de-escalation. For the purpose of this paper, I focus primarily on social conflict or conflict between groups, which has been defined as a struggle for agency or power in a society. It is manifested by the intractability of the ambitions and aspirations of two or more opposing forces. Conflict and aggression have been inherent to human civilization since time immemorial. According to C. Wright Mills, conflict theory is essentially grounded on the existence of the power elite, to be understood as what is currently commonly known as the military-industrial complex. The policies of the power elite and the inequalities in society would incite and escalate conflicts. Several theories have also been proposed regarding the roots of conflict and civic unrest. For most part, the root cause has been made out to be humans' inherent genetic bias towards aggression and their need to maximize their chances of survival by maximizing their benefits and seeking resources which are largely scarce. War has also been explained as a learned behavior, that war is widespread in our shared history. However, the most empirically valid theory is the relative deprivation theory, which states that the gap in a group with a shared common identity, usually their ethnicity or their religion, between their expected and actual access to prosperity. Women and children present as a vulnerable section of society, even under regular circumstances. During instability and war, their insecurities are amplified and heightened. Most of the research conducted on the effects of civic unrest and armed conflict and their influences on women propound on the fact that war and violence is the domain of men, and when they leave households to participate, or in the events of their deaths, they leave the dependent population, usually the women and children, rudderless. So studies have pointed out that 80% of displaced people post-armed conflict tend to be women and children. Even before they're left to fend for themselves in detention camps or refugee camps, they often experience sexual violence from combatants. The issues persist in camps, which see very little policing, and the social stigma attached often compels victims to keep mum. Studies have suggested that women form between 10 to 33% of a military force. Recruitment of women and children serves to offer social legitimacy to any cause, and attacking them seems to undermine the movement. Sexual violence is therefore a predominant and a common theme across most conflicts. Since women are often primary caretakers, their vulnerability and victimization are compounded into children. Children have gradually become deliberate targets rather than incidental victims. The recruitment of children as soldiers and cadre is the most notable manifestation of this exploitation of children in violent combats. Recruitment of children puts them at a higher risk of mental stress and behavioral problems, and research suggests that they have a higher incidence rate for risk and injury. Children are extremely pliable and relatively easy to brainwash and manipulate, and their obedience to authority makes them particularly attractive as recruits. Moreover, children rarely understand the risks associated with combat situations. We must note that the role women play is not limited to being passive victims, but also as agents of peace, and in some cases also as perpetrators of combat and instability. Recent studies have focused on women as negotiators of peace and stability, especially at a community level. Giving them greater agency in such a role could be very beneficial due to the roles they play in community integration and community building. However, this theory has been called out for overplaying women's stereotypical role as nurturers. The power dynamic in patriarchal societies nonetheless indeed does make women more suitable negotiators, as they rely more on consensus building and compromise rather than establishing authority. Women and their unique roles in society hence make them excellent candidates to enable a demilitarized peace through their participation of the civilians and community. Moving on to the Sri Lankan Civil War. Ethnic discrimination was identified as the root cause of conflict, although it alone is clearly an insufficient reason. As Shivani, who just went before me, spoke about it, the Democratic Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka lies just south of the tip of India. It gained full independence from the British rule in 1948 and changed its name from Ceylon in 1972. The scenic country has been the setting for one of the most longest and violent confrontations, which was fought between the state and LTTE, a terrorist group that claimed to be the face of the Tamil resistance. The conflict lasted for over 25 years and raked up a death toll between 80,000 to 100,000 and displaced over 800,000 people. The Sri Lankan majority, the Sinhala population, had historically resented the minority Tamil population. The British government granted preferential treatment to the burghers, Sri Lankan elites, and Tamils as part of their divide and rule policy. This led to the native Sinhalese population to believe that they were disenfranchised. When Tamil nationalist movements were set up in the earlier days of freedom, up until the 1950s, separatist notions were not brought up, and political agendas promoted only equality and integration. This was quickly followed with reforms that cemented the state language as Sinhala and the state religion as Buddhism, further alienating the Tamil population, escalating the resentments till when, in around 1976, the Tamil population mobilized and demanded at first an autonomous region for the Tamils in the north and east of the island, and later for a separate state. Several groups were formed, including the eventual leader of the Tamil resistance, Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, in 1976. Following several violent clashes, starting with the Sinhalese mob killing around 300 Tamils in 1977, to the burning down of the iconic Jaffna Public Library in 1981, the civil war formally began in 1983, when the LTTE ambushed an army convoy, killing 13 soldiers and triggering Black July, when an organized mob rioted and triggered the deaths of an estimated 1,000 to 3,000 Tamils. This encouraged more Tamil youth to join the LTTE, which established itself as the face of the Tamilians during the war. This prompted the deployment of the Indian Peacekeeping Force, IPKF, by the then Prime Minister of India, Rajiv Gandhi, under the Indo-Sri Lankan Accord. The situation further escalated with the assassination of Rajiv Gandhi by a suicide bomber in 1991, which led to a recall of the IPKF. The situation kept degrading, with many political figures being assassinated, and several peace efforts and talks failed. The conflict finally came to a climax when the LTTE called a unilateral ceasefire in late April 2009, and the Sri Lankan army formally announced the end of the war after capturing and killing the LTTE leader Velupillai Prabhakaran in May 2009. Moving on to women as victims. In the case of Sri Lanka, it is important to note that gender disaggregated data is largely absent, and the available data too has been questioned by several agencies. Data relating exclusive to children is also absent. Present data lacks necessary details such as age, gender, and location disaggregation, and several independent and reliable agencies have attributed this to politically motivated concealing and underreporting of data. Sexual violence, as I already mentioned, was predominant and a common theme across most conflicts, especially in Sri Lanka. Estimates suggest that a woman is raped every 90 minutes. Several reports say that over 14% of the Sri Lankan female populace was victim to rape, sexual abuse, or violence to sexual organs. This number only rose in the months post-resolution of conflict. Women were forced to endure sexual abuse, harassment, and indignity at the hands of the Sri Lankan Armed Forces personnel and Tamil men, although claims have been made stating that the LTT outlawed sexual violence within their ranks. Several rapes were also reported at detention camps by other residents. Reports have also been made about grease devils, naked men who applied grease to conceal their faces and attacked and raped Tamil women, mostly towards the last phase of the conflict in the north and eastern regions. Allegations have been made that these men were likely army personnel. The detention camps housed around 90,000 widows, a third of whom reportedly had more than 2 kids. The war saw over 700 still detained in rehabilitation centers under suspicion of allegiance to LTTE. Of the 700, 100 were reportedly women. To evade suspicion and recruitment, women often entered marital contracts. In the former instance, female cadre pretended to be married to random men and kept up the farce in camps as well to evade capture. And keeping up this act often came at the price of them having to engage in sexual relationships with their so-called husbands. This came with the additional burden of stigmatization by the society. And since the relationship was only fictitious, when the suspicion eventually wore off, the women were abandoned. In the case of the latter, young girls, some as young as 12, would get married to escape recruitment. These young brides later became young mothers, many of whom were later widowed and burdened with families and an absence of any familial support. Moving on to women as combatants. Within a few years of establishing LTTE, they began taking in female recruits and were renowned for their active recruitment of women since the mid-1980s. LTTE's primary goal was to liberate the Tamil population, and that took the form of not only autonomy, but also ridding the community of social evils such as caste system, dowries, and gender discrimination. Women made up about a third of the cadre and formed an integral part of various sections of the organization. In 1983, the LTTE created a separate division of female cadres called the Vidudalai Pulikal Munani, or the Women's Front of Liberation Tigers. The female cadres were also called the Birds of Freedom and performed various roles, including propaganda, other supporting administrative roles, and later as active combatants, and also received training, including as suicide bombers. Some of the most well-noted and identified female cadre include Adele Balasingham, an Australian nurse who went on to lead the Women's Front, Tamilini, or Shivagami Subramaniam, was a senior member responsible for recruitment and networking and was the head of the organization's political wing. Isaipriya was another noted female recruit. Though not an active part of the combat force, she was regularly seen as a spokesperson for the outfit, seen in videos singing and dancing to promote LTTE. The Sri Lankan Army too had a 7-battalion strong force in the Sri Lankan Army Women's Corps, first established in 1979. Women constitute roughly 10% of the standing army. While most were originally recruited to take up administrative tasks, their roles have expanded to field duty as well. Moving on to children. The presence of military checkposts, which were frequently targeted in close proximity of hospitals and schools, and using school premises as a base of operations is very indicative of the principle of victimizing women and children to inflict further damage. In a military-led attack on a cluster of hamlets near Batikola, 68 children were amongst the presumed dead. And in an LTTE attack on a village in Trincomalee, 6 children were amongst those killed. Data related to deaths caused by landmines and unexploded ordnances, or UXOs, are more available. In a 2001 compilation of data of deaths caused in Jaffna, 53 children were killed. As of early 2001, over 1,000 children were accommodated in state-operated institutes for orphans. Child recruitments, by most accounts, began at the very beginning of the onset of the war. Various accounts state that the LTTE regularly visited families and insisted on recruiting at least one member, usually the male child, as part of the movement, going so far as harassing those who did not comply and even threatening them with further violence. The LTTE poached children as young as 11. The baby brigade was usually integrated into other brigades, while the leopard brigade, or the Sirute Puligal, is supposed to have been one of the fiercest fighting forces, composed almost entirely out of children recruited through LTTE-run orphanages. Reports suggest that as of 2004, the LTTE had recruited, trained, and used over 3,000 child soldiers, a substantial number of whom were stationed on front lines. A report suggests that around 40% of these child recruits were girls. During the 1990s, between 40% and 60% of those killed as LTTE and identified as LTTE combatants were reportedly minors. Over the span of the 25-year-long war, close to 7,000 child soldiers were reportedly recruited, of whom 1,300 are still missing. The Sri Lankan Army's allied Tamil wing, the Karna group, officially known as the Tamil Makkal Viduthai Pulikal, was also accused of recruiting child soldiers, predominantly from the IDP camps. Excuse me. The LTTE was amongst the first terrorist organizations in the world to use suicide bombing, and often used women as suicide bombers, since they were likely to pass through security checkpoints relatively unscathed. In a study conducted, 30% of suicide bombing incidents were conducted by women alone, averaging roughly 12 fatalities per incident. Since its inception, there were around 200 instances of suicide bombings, a substantial number of which were carried out by girl children. Moving on to the aftermath. As of 2012, most of the militants have been de-radicalized, with reports suggesting that around 11,000 militants were accepted into rehabilitation programs at PRACs, Protective Accommodation and Rehabilitation Centers, and less than 1,000 still remain at such facilities. However, reports also indicate high levels of custodial violence in these institutes and the lack of government transparency and bureaucratic red tape impeding external verification has consistently been highlighted as an issue. An Office of Missing Persons, OMP, and a Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Committee, or LLRC, were also set up, but whose functionality and efficacy were questioned by authorities and international bodies. The OMP's mandate was to identify, locate, and redress missing persons and make recommendations to prevent recurrence. Its most urgent recommendations included more straight redressal mechanisms and accountability for several claims of human rights violations, including the detention and disappearance of civilians and suspected LTTE cadre. The LLRC was an important commission that was formed to understand the exigencies under which the 2002 ceasefire was broken and the measures to be taken to ensure that such incidents could not be repeated, and suggestions for reintegration and better assimilation of the rival groups. I'm sorry. Some of the compensatory measures include reparations for loss of life at most 50,000 Lankan rupees and property damage for 1 lakh Lankan rupees. Other rehabilitative policies include psychosocial support for women and youth and greater communal integration from school levels. Infrastructural development of most of the affected regions has also been highlighted. In 2015 and 2016, over 850 loans worth 137 million Lankan rupees were dispersed for self-employment loans in war-affected areas. Most of the reparations were concentrated in the worst affected areas, that were Jaffna, Kilinochchi, Patikola, Mullaitivu, Ampara, and Trincomalee. The Sri Lankan civil war has been one of the most violent confrontations in recent times. Both sides perpetrated large-scale crimes against humanity and several violations. Both sides were frequently accused of ill attempts at brokering peace through dialogue and other non-violent means. While the LTTE has been criticized for provoking military action and violently suppressing dissent within ranks and forcefully recruiting women and children as soldiers, the government too has seen its fair share of criticisms, especially with regards to the sanctioning of extrajudicial killings, forced disappearances, shelling of no-fire zones, and rape and other atrocities committed by armed force personnel. The last phase of the war saw some of the most brutal crimes committed, with some sources claiming that this phase alone saw the deaths of around 70,000 people. The human rights atrocities perpetrated on the Mahinda Rajapaksa government were hushed up once they were brought to light, and active efforts were made to suppress the dissenting voices. The state has been accused of causing the deaths of 3 reporters and labeling dissenters as terrorists and traitors. In 2014, foreign investigators representing the UN were denied entry into war zones following reports of non-cooperation of the Sri Lankan government. The LTTE too was accused of large-scale violations of human rights. Several reports have condemned their forced recruitments of women and children as cadre. LTTE was amongst the first terrorist organizations to have used cyanide pills and suicide bombers. The scale of violence, the details regarding the exact death toll, number of people displaced, gender and location disaggregated data, and details pertaining to the nature and severity of extrajudicial operations undertaken by the state have all been concealed by the state or not accurately recorded. The most pressing need is to ensure an independent and unbiased third-party agency's investigation into the reports of the various war crimes committed. Accountability is the first step in the long healing process that is demanded of one of the most violent and brutal civil wars of the 21st century. The victims, especially the women and children, need financial support immediately. Even though the war drew to a close, it is important to note its lasting consequences, especially the overwhelming death toll of primary earners and family units. In the absence of the male breadwinner, the onus often falls on the women, since patriarchal norms governing society renders women ill-prepared to step up and avail gainful employment. Other suggested financial benefits include housing benefits, debt relief, and other social benefit schemes, such as education programs, vocational training and skill development, and employment quotas that are imperative to ensure better assimilation and integration into mainstream society. Development projects rarely bring women and female-headed households into the fold. While the rhetoric consistently points out such needs, subsequent policies do not reflect the same. The biggest challenge post-war has been to rebuild trust between the state authorities and Tamil civilians. The roots of the Tamil conflict are embedded in resentment and divisiveness, and as such, this has to be treated as an extremely important issue that needs to be immediately addressed. The biggest challenge post-war, lastly, it is important to know the psychological impact of such a traumatizing event. The women and children who have been victimized at the hands of the combatants need urgent psychological help and most also require medical assistance, considering the prevalence of sexual assault and violence that was rampant throughout the war. The combatants, especially the forced recruits and child soldiers, need to be rehabilitated and debriefed. Such incidents leave lasting mental impacts on anyone, more so on children. They go on to manifest themselves in the form of personality disorders and inability in functioning normally in society, especially one as fractured as Sri Lanka. That's the end of my presentation.